Milford High School in Milford, Delaware, is one of the state's many public high schools. Serving students in both Kent and Sussex County, the school, with its marching band, many sports programs, and an active student body, provides students with learning experiences commonly offered by public high schools throughout the state. The students enrolled there reflect the complete racial diversity of the town and its surrounding communities. But 70 years ago, Milford's student body makeup was very different. Like the community it served, the school was segregated, a practice recognized by law throughout the state. As a border state during the Civil War, many Delawareans sympathized with the Southern cause. As many as 2,500 men, mostly from the lower part of the state, served in the Confederate Army. Following the war, Southern sympathies prevailed along with the accepted practice of segregation.
Delaware, especially Southern Delaware, always kind of gravitated towards the South. So it was part of the culture. Not suggesting it was right, I'm just saying it's part of the historical culture of the separation of races, either by tradition, local tradition, or by, in the case of public education, Supreme Court ruling.
Shortly after the Civil War ended, 3 amendments were added to the Constitution to guarantee equality for African Americans. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 15th granted all black men the right to vote. Yet it was the 14th Amendment that clearly defined for the states what it meant to treat all citizens equally, including African Americans. It defined citizenship rights, due process, and equal protection under the law. In doing so, it addressed a concern by some in Congress that the legal rights of African Americans might eventually be undermined.
There was a perceived view that there would be a slide, as indeed, starting after the 1876 election, there did become a slide, and the so-called Jim Crow laws came into play.
First enacted in former Confederate states, Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in all public facilities. In 1892, to challenge such legislation in Louisiana, Homer Plessy, a black man, deliberately boarded a whites-only New Orleans streetcar and was promptly arrested. 4 years later, his case had been appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that segregation was permissible under the 14th Amendment.
The 1896 Supreme Court ruling established the doctrine of separate but equal. That is, races could be in separate schools, separate transportation, made to sit in separate parts of a movie theater. And that was okay with the Supreme Court.
So separate but equal, even though that applied to rail cars, became across the board in connection with segregation of the races.
Segregation had slowly been evolving in the South before and after the Plessy case, but the Plessy case gave it the Supreme Court's stamp of approval.
The Plessy decision encouraged the passage of segregation legislation, and Jim Crow laws were eventually enacted in 17 states, including Delaware.
When you start talking about segregation, yeah, we knew of it, but it was almost like the norm for us growing up. That's just the way life was back then.
You could not go to the movies and sit with the whites. You could not go into restaurants and buy food and sit down and eat. You had to buy and leave. So it was something that was commonplace, so it was something that we grew used to.
My mother remembers walking on a sidewalk from the grocery store in Lewis, Delaware, where we also lived, and an African-American gentleman literally stepped off the sidewalk to let her by.
In response to locally enacted Jim Crow legislation, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, filed suit in various states. Rather than addressing the issue of segregation head-on, they challenged the inequities of the separate but equal public education experience offered blacks and whites. This argument was easier to prove, but left local Jim Crow laws in place. By 1950, they had won several important Supreme Court cases based on this strategy. Feeling the time was right, the NAACP then filed a series of cases that directly challenged the legality of segregation under the 14th Amendment. Two of the cases originated in Delaware.
Beulah versus Gebhardt and Belton versus Gebhardt. One involved schools in Hockessin, and the other involved schools in Claymont. And these two cases were brought by Lewis Redding.
Lewis Redding, Delaware's first black attorney, and his NAACP co-counsel, Jack Greenberg, carefully argued that Delaware's colored schools were inferior to neighboring white schools, and therefore black children were being denied an equal educational experience. The NAACP had lost 3 similar cases in state courts elsewhere, but the 2 from Delaware were decided otherwise.
When Delaware ruled in favor of Beulah and Belton, the plaintiffs, Thurgood Marshall said it was the first major victory in the road to desegregating public schools in America.
With opposing rulings handed down in different state courts, the 5 cases were combined into one, Brown versus Board of Education, and ultimately argued before the Supreme Court.
They're all equal in the eyes of their country. They are the youth of America, a young and still growing nation, growing in the steady realization of its ideals of democracy and equality. In May 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest tribunal in the land, carried this American ideal of public education another step forward. In a unanimous decision, the 9 Supreme Court justices ruled racial segregation in publicly supported schools to be unconstitutional, declaring that it denied equal opportunity.
A lot of the schools said before the Supreme Court, we're taking measures to make the facilities equal. And ultimately the Supreme Court said, even if they are equal, it places a badge of inferiority on the students in the African American schools, and we hold this is a violation of equal protection of the 14th Amendment.
One of my memories of Milford was the segregation and the notion that if we were good enough, that we would be able to go to the white school. If we were good enough, we would be able to be considered right somehow. So one of my memories in Milford is to be known, to know that I was not right, that I had to do something different in order to feel or to be right.
Delaware was one of the states that legally endorsed and practiced segregation. This meant separate but equal education for those living in towns such as Milford.
There was a black section, there was a white section. The black children went to a black elementary school, the white children went to a white elementary school.
Milford also had an all-white high school, despite its small size.
Well, it was a small town. You know, we had My high school class, when I graduated in '56, only had 69 people in it. I think there were 5,000 people in the town, so it was a very small market town in a rural area.
Meanwhile, Benjamin Banneker, the one black school, served a dual purpose.
Banneker was a unique environment educationally because we went from first grade to ninth grade in that setting.
Banneker was in the black district, and until you went to high school, it was 2 grades in a classroom.
To finish high school, black students had to travel 20 miles to one of the 2 colored high schools in Lower Delaware, William Henry in Dover or William C. Jason in Georgetown. Blacks had never been allowed to attend Milford High.
So it's not surprising that a seemingly sudden Supreme Court ruling impacted the whole country. And here in Milford, we had this school board that decided to follow what the Supreme Court said to do.
Several Newcastle County schools had already desegregated, and after the May ruling, Attorney Lewis Redding and others were determined to integrate more schools in Delaware. Redding made a strategic choice in approaching the Milford School Board. The town straddled the state's 2 lower counties, and Milford High School served students in both. To help persuade the board and ensure a smooth transition, Redding knew he had to find the most qualified black students.
Learning was never difficult for me, and when I graduated from Banneker, I was the valedictorian of the class.
Redding partnered with Reverend Fisher of St. Paul's United Methodist Church to inform black parents of the opportunity now available for the recent Banneker graduates.
Mom and Daddy always went to the PTA meetings, the NAACP meetings. One night, Reverend Fisher was having a meeting. When Mom and Daddy came home, they told me that I would be starting the 10th grade at Milford High School. They said, you know how to act, you know how to pray, and you're gonna be fine. I was a 15-year-old sheltered kid. We trusted our parents to guide us. So I thought nothing about it.
Despite having serious concerns, but assured of black parental support, the Milford School Board moved forward with their plan.
They decided, in the light of the Brown ruling, to take those 11 students who had just graduated from the all-black school, Benjamin Banneker in Milford, and put them in the 10th grade. They didn't really formalize that until August, and remember, the clock is ticking, so the community doesn't really know that much about all this.
So on September 8, 1954, 11 black Banneker graduates joined 687 white students and quietly entered Milford High, integrating the school's student body for the first time.
When we showed up for the first day of school on the 10th grade, there were the 11 black students. Nobody had known, at least we the students had known, that they were going to be there.
It's uncomfortable, we didn't know how to deal with them, and we weren't used to it. We had to adjust, and they had to adjust, but there was nothing turned up in school.
It was oil and water. We were there together. We did not mix. If we had to communicate, we communicated. I know there was some degree of integration on the athletic teams because many of the black boys were damn good athletes. And indeed, many of the white athletes had played baseball and basketball, in integrated, informal teams. So having black boys try out for the football team was perfectly natural.
But while sports promised some acceptance for the boys, the black girls found school a lonely, painful, and humiliating experience.
I was the only black that was in my class. Nobody paid you any attention. Nobody spoke to you, not a soul. And then I had a teacher. He was in the classroom, it was history, and he said that they should send us all back to Africa. All the kids laughed and whatever. For them, it was funny.
Classes proceeded uneventfully for the next 7 days as the larger community gradually heard about the major change in the school's enrollment.
Children were coming home and saying, "Hey, Dad, there's in the language of the times, there's a colored kid in my math class. There's a colored kid on the football team. There's a colored kid in my gym class." And by and large, that's how most of the community found out about this momentous change.
Rumors spread around the school, which only heightened tensions.
Just what started this whole thing, fellas?
I don't know of any particular incidents that really started the thing off. I know the student council was going to have a dance, and then some rumors got around about one of the colored boys making a date with one of the girls out at school, which wasn't true, and that got around. It was just all rumors, I believe.
Having permitted the integration of...
With rumors spreading and no advance notice about the new school policy, the white community reacted strongly. After only 8 days of classes, they presented the board with a petition signed by over 1,000 residents opposing integration during a heated public meeting at the school.
Authorities shall immediately remove said colored children from attendance at classes at said white schools.
Fearing violence, the board immediately closed the school until further notice, attracting news coverage from around the country.
What do you fellas think about all the fuss they're kicking up down here over the school situation?
Well, I think it's a lot of nonsense, and they should stop and let us get back to school.
And back to the football team?
Yeah, back to the football team.
Then, young lady, what do you think about Milford High School's troubles?
Well, I don't think it is actually the children's fault. I think it's more the parents, because it seems as if it's the parents that want us to go out there.
The problem was generated not within the school. It was generated by people outside the school.
Nobody really worked with the two schools to inform both blacks and whites exactly what was going to happen and how. If they had done that, they could have worked it out, even in 1954, I think. But it was so much ignorance.
For the remainder of the week, Milford High remained closed. The school board appealed to the state for help, and the governor received numerous letters reflecting both sides of the issue. By Friday, the school board had resigned, and the governor ordered the school to reopen the following Monday. The Milford story was now national news and attracted an outsider, Bryant Bowles.
Probably one of the most despicable characters in Delaware history showed up at the peak of the fermentation of all these emotions. He had already been arrested several times for writing bad checks, so he had a bad track record. But along the way, he started the National Association for the Advancement of White People, the NAAWP, as opposed to the historic NAACP.
This meeting is being sponsored by the National Association for Advancement of White People.
That Sunday, Bowles held an outdoor rally to establish a Delaware chapter in nearby Harrington that drew 3,000 people.
His deal was, hey, the black people have the NAACP, and now that I'm here with the NAAWP, you have a spokesman for your cause, your interest. I can do it, and as the peach basket goes around, please make a contribution. The median income in Milford in that time was about $3,000 a year, and people were throwing $10, $20, and $50 bills in that peach basket. So Bryant, he was a racist, there's no question about that, but he was also an opportunist.
Let us keep our children home from school for 9 months. Good long time in it.
Ernest Macklin, one of the new chapter leaders, then urged the crowd to boycott the school's reopening. Monday morning found an angry white mob in front of the school and few children in the arriving buses.
I just remember as we saw all those people being out in front of the school, this mob of people calling you all kind of names. When they brought us up to the school, they took us to a side door and they told us to hurry inside. It wasn't a happy time because I don't know what they would have done to us if they had gotten to us.
Along with the crowd protest, pro-segregation parents followed Macklin's directive, keeping their children home from Milford and other Sussex schools.
I rode the Lincoln bus. The Lincoln bus was usually mostly full of children going to Milford. During the boycott, there were 2 and sometimes 3 white students on the bus.
My recollection is that there was a big number of people who did not come to school. And the people who came to school thought that they were doing the right thing.
The protesters noted the white students that did show up, made harassing phone calls, and even sought out their parents to argue their case.
One evening, we got a visit from 2 pickup trucks filled with 4 men, and they came in and sat politely on our sofa and chairs. And what they wanted to speak about was to convince my father to join the boycott.
Meanwhile, for the 11 black students, schoolwork was now the least of their concerns.
My daddy worked at a garage, and he's the only black person that was at that garage working. And I know that they knew that Daddy's daughter was one of the students trying to integrate Milford School. And I think about what my dad had to go through, knowing that his daughter could be in trouble, and there was really no way that he could save me.
It was really a time when people were afraid because there was just so much uprising there, and even riding through the black community with their bullhorns and protesting. And I remember a lot of the black men in the community actually got together and decided that if indeed the whites started to antagonize the Milford blacks, they were going to use their guns on them.
In just 2 days, the Milford boycott spread throughout the county. Neighboring schools closed due to lack of attendance, and blacks in the surrounding area also felt threatened.
We had gone to my uncle's, and we were all the way out in Houston. Seemed like it was the darkest night in the world. And they had burned a cross over to his house. We got in the car and came back to Milford, and that night we found out that they had burned a cross uptown. That's one night that I was really, really scared.
There was a tremendous concern in the community when the Bowles thing came up that there was going to be violence. There was real fear in the community, at least from his conversation I had with my father, and that's one of the reasons he was involved.
Without a legally governing school board, nothing could change. Ed Steiner's father was a prominent Milford businessman and in a unique position to step in and help.
Dad's business did not have customers in town, so his business was not threatened the way some other town leaders could have been threatened if they had been involved. So Dad agreed to get on the school board and was elected president of the school board at that time.
On September 30th, the same day they were appointed, the new Milford School Board voted, in the interest of the welfare of the children and the community, to remove the 11 Negro students from the enrollment records of the school, effective immediately.
The very last day that I was there, I was in a hockey class, and they came and got me, and they told me that I had to leave. They had the state police up there to make sure that we got back to town safely, because the state could no longer keep us safe.
The board also appealed to all the constituents of the Milford School District to send their children to school the next morning. On October 1st, after only 12 days of classes, the 1954 attempt to integrate Milford High School had failed. With Milford High once again all white, students there settled into a daily routine. But for the 11 black students, they now needed a school.
My brothers and sisters would get up in the morning and they would get ready to go to school, and I'm home all day. That didn't set too well with me, but I had to wait until the state made a decision on where they were going to send me, because they had to educate me.
Eventually, all 11 students were enrolled in William C. Jason, the colored high school in Georgetown. But Milford's attempt at school integration continued to have repercussions locally and even nationally.
My father, when he went into the school board to the kids out, he was perceived locally as an integrationist. He was perceived nationally as a bad guy because he was involved in asking the black kids to leave. So it's kind of a funny interaction where we would get letters from all over the country saying, "You bad guy." And there were people in town knowing that he was on the other side, and we had a cross burned in our front yard.
The country's mixed reaction to the Supreme Court decision was based in part on local laws and traditions, but also on the scope of the ruling itself.
The Supreme Court did something very wisely. We will put off the remedy. We want to hear from the states. We want to hear from the school board in Topeka, because we want you to be part of this. We need to work this out. And as we saw in places like Delaware, there was in Milford a very significant backlash.
Still hoping to implement the Supreme Court ruling, the Milford School Board sought advice from Delaware's judiciary throughout the fall.
Milford School Board, wanting as much clarification as they could get, took that and appealed that to the Delaware State Supreme Court, who said, yes, African-American kids should be able to go to Milford schools, but everybody needs to wait until they get the operational Supreme Court ruling, which would be known as Brown 2. And that would tell schools how to proceed in school integration across the country.
That ruling came a year later, on May 31st, 1955, when the U.S. Supreme Court instructed the states to desegregate with all deliberate speed.
Now, what does all deliberate speed mean? Speed means one thing, but deliberate sounds like an oxymoron. And that's the way some people read it. And the thought was, okay, we're going to be not slow walked, but no walked.
Earlier that same month, Milford held its annual school board election. Ed Steiner and the moderates were up for another term, but Bryant Bowles was on the radio endorsing the opposing candidates.
Now just remember, if you want to keep your schools white, go to the poll and vote for Max Carter, Creer Bennett Jr., George Robbins, and Ernest Macklin, and they will help you.
Of course, that was a huge vote. I mean, it looked like 80% of the people eligible voted. That was unbelievable, you know. And my father got in a lot of trouble because he went to 2 different polling places to vote to prove how corrupt the process was. And that's why he did that. He had this reporter with him.
The segregationist slate won by a 3-2 margin, ensuring that Milford High School would remain segregated going forward. Yet there were changes occurring elsewhere that began undermining the hardliners' position as early as that fall.
We had always had our traditional Thanksgiving football game with Dover. And at that time, by that time, the desegregation school board had one and was in charge of the school. And they canceled our football game with Dover because Dover had a black kid on the team. And that generated considerable concern in the school by a wide number of kids. There are a lot of us, both guys who did not go to school during the boycott and people who did, who wanted to play the football game. They didn't want to get involved in this foolishness. So we petitioned the school board and to try to get it, but they refused to give in to us.
I don't think in the minds of many who were opposed to integration that they said, Eureka, I'm wrong, and yes, we should follow the law. It just kind of wore them down.
But for the next 7 years, attending Milford High was not an option for Milford's black students.
I had always anticipated going to Milford High because that was what we had been conditioned to believe would be optimal for us. But once I realized that Edna was not able to go there, that there was a hostility there, I decided I did not want to be in a hostile place. And I'm glad I did. I would not have been able to survive at Milford High, I don't believe.
Finally, in early 1961, with Kennedy now in office, whatever reservations the board had about integrating the school were dispelled after an enlightening trip to the Department of Justice in Washington.
They rode to Washington, met with an education specialist in that Department of Justice, and to their shock, it was a lawyer who was a woman and who had graduated from Harvard. And she said, fellas, here's the deal. You can resist and not follow the order and not follow the Supreme Court, but you will miss out on getting hundreds of thousands of dollars for your school district from federal funds. That was pretty much the end of the meeting. The story, as it was told to me by, I think, a reliable source, said they got back in their car and they were kind of stunned and really didn't say much until they crossed over the Bay Bridge at Annapolis, and then they started talking.
If you lived in Sussex County, you went to Jason. If you lived in Kent County, you went to William Henry. So it was a part of our being that, you know, that was what we were going to do.
However, these two colored high schools were each 20 miles from Milford.
My uncle, Hayes Fountain, had the bus route to William Henry High School, and a lot of the kids would form up right out there in front of my house in my neighborhood and catch that bus at 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning. So I was not looking forward to catching that bus and riding to Henry and then get home sometimes maybe after 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening.
Milford High School was a lot closer, and community attitudes were changing.
I think it was time, I think it was general pressure, I think it was the law, and I think it was the availability of funding that you didn't want to waste that. I mean, how would a school board member say, we didn't do this, and we lost $800,000?
The administrators at Banneker made it known that that was an option for us. They didn't force us or try to force us to go to Milford High or any school, and we just took it from that standpoint.
Some in the community thought that only Banneker's best and brightest were encouraged to pursue this opportunity.
A fella told me, he said, yeah, that's all true, but those were the kids that could probably handle it the best, and that was part of the calculation.
Unlike in 1954, this time each Banneker student made their own decision about whether to enroll in Milford High.
The reason why I think I really went to Milford High was due to peer pressure. Simply because the 6, 7, actually more than that of us have grown up from grade 1. And now we have graduated from Banneker in the 9th grade. We all played sports, so we had that kind of camaraderie. So I felt like if they're gonna go, I'm gonna go.
The one disadvantage was that we left a lot of our friends who we had gone to school with from 1st grade to 9th grade, who went to William Henry or they went to William C. Jason. They took the route that was traditional for us at that particular time. So we didn't know that we were going to be trailblazers. We just decided that let's do that because we don't want to get up there early in the morning.
So for the 6 male students, choosing Milford High meant no early morning bus rides and a shorter school day. But for Ovida Whaley, the only black female, the choice meant the best educational path towards pursuing her goal of becoming a nurse. Unlike the others, however, Ovida lived outside of town, which meant she took a bus to school each morning.
She rode the bus by herself, and she experienced a lot of racism during that time, and the bus driver allowed those things to happen. She would not come to school and even talk about it to us, and we were close. I don't know how she did it, but she did do it. To me, she was the heroine of the group for having the courage to stand up to that in her own way.
Looking back, Ovida claims that her goal of getting a good education is what allowed her to persevere, and her Milford diploma helped fulfill her dream. The 6 young men had it somewhat easier. They were not only close friends, but had played sports together at Banneker.
Our track team obviously was all black that came from Benjamin Banneker School, and we were very good. When we went to Milford High, we did not allow any whites to be on our team. It wasn't that we were being segregated or anything like that. It was a case that this was a group of young men who really knew each other, and we were a team.
The camaraderie that we had dealing with sports made it a lot easier for us to be competitive.
So yes, I would say that there was some acceptance that came about. I can recall one player on the basketball team when he invited us over to his house for a get-together after a sports event. And you know, that you just wouldn't have thought of coming up the way that we came up.
Yet while acceptance was growing at school, the old ways prevailed everywhere else.
When you were at school, people started to be very cordial toward you. But if you went downtown, the same people that were cordial to you at school, they wouldn't speak to you when you were downtown. You know, we had to grow up in this kind of society in which you had that dichotomy that was always there.
Through the 60s, Milford attitudes slowly changed, and color barriers eventually fell. But it took time and baby steps, often prompted by annual high school rituals that inadvertently broke long-held segregationist traditions.
When we graduated from Milford High School, which was at the Shine Theater, where we had to sit upstairs, but on that day, not only did we sit downstairs, we walked across the stage and got our diplomas. I saw my grandfather there, my father there, and I don't know how much they went through in their lifetime of just not being able to sit downstairs at that theater, but we made it happen. "70 years ago, the Supreme Court knew the Brown versus Board of Education ruling was a momentous decision. They knew it demanded a dramatic change in public education and would challenge the personal values of many Americans. They also knew
it would take time to be fully realized.
The instincts of the Supreme Court, in hindsight, appear to have been correct. Let's be unanimous. Let's make it a clear and direct, easily understandable ruling. And let's not force it down people's throat immediately. Did it take far too long for many? Sure it did, without a doubt.
It was probably too soon because it was 10 years later that it was integrated, and while they went through some things, they didn't have to go through the things that we went through.
Looking back, it's clear that the process of integrating Milford High could have been handled better. But there were also long-accepted racial practices and beliefs to overcome.
That's a legacy of going back to the Civil War. I mean, a lot of Sussex County boys went off to fight for the Confederates. It's also a legacy of the Jim Crow era, which was legally validated by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896.
I think it was ignorance and fear. And a lot of white people were afraid of black people, period. And I think they really thought that blacks were going to be retaliatory in their actions and were going to take out the hatreds that they had experienced through slavery. That wasn't going to happen.
And while Milford's resistance did make national headlines, it never rose to the level of what occurred in other places around the country.
Milford was never Little Rock. They never brought in the National Guard. The problem was resolved or addressed over time.
During the 60s, I think people just were gradually realizing that those are individuals, we got to treat them that way, and it's the law of the land, and we're not going to fight the law of the land. And as time went by, people got to know them as individuals, not as part of a class, which is the key to everything.
Now, 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education, Milford High offers all its students the same educational opportunities. Yet elsewhere, the historic artifacts of legal segregation, such as racially defined neighborhoods, continue to challenge how best to meet the intended goal of the Supreme Court ruling.
The communities, if they're mostly black, the schools are black, or if they're mostly white, then the schools are white. So while that's starting slowly to break down, there are lots of vestiges of the segregated system that persist into the present.
There's always going to be, as we say in the courts, fussing and feuding. And when it's going to stop, I don't know. Thurgood Marshall may have been right, or you just got to chip away at it and keep chipping and keep chipping.
The 1954 attempt to integrate Milford High chipped away at a long-accepted segregationist practice, but failed. Yet only 11 years later, 7 African Americans successfully graduated from the once all-white school.
It happened. And because it happened, I think that it opened up different doors for us. We all went on to various professions. A pastor to come out of the group, a couple school teachers, a couple military officers. So it was an opportunity.
Integrating Milford High also chipped away at a long-held assumption within the black community.
Some of the students that came behind us that also went to Milford High said that we were the ones that influenced their thinking, instead of going the traditional way of William Henry or William C. Jason.
I interviewed Mr. Hayes Fountain, who was a major player in Milford's African American community. And he had children in school that, made the switch to integration. I said, okay, now that you were integrated, what did it mean to you? And his answer was so succinct and clear. He said it meant we had a chance. And that's what I think is the big lesson that came out of 1954 Public education is to give all kids a chance for success in their life.